Returnability. Why does it matter? And why should comic fans who are wanting to talk about the current market and what needs to be done to improve it and everything else, why should you understand returnability? Well, I mean, because it factors so heavily into any kind of discussion about the future business model. So I've done this video before, like a zillion times now. Not that many, but a lot. But let's talk about returnability one more time. Hey everybody, this is Perch. Why does returnability matter and why do people harp on it? Well, because returnability is a factor of the newsstand. So if you're looking at comics that are sold, there was for a long time the newsstand, which means comics sold in grocery stores and gas stations and adult video stores. I mean, where probably not that one, but lots of places. And then there was a direct market, which was sold to comic stores. Now, there are a lot of little nuances and differences, and yes, those matter and everything else. But for the sake of this discussion, everything else, we're going to explain that the newsstand was grocery stores and gas stations, and the direct market is comic book shops. And the difference between the two is the newsstand had returnability, which is the point of this video, and the direct market did not. So why do those things matter? Well, in the simplest possible terms, the newsstand could order comics and they could order like 200,000 copies of a comic for their chain of stores. So let's say you're part of the, Kroger, Safeway, whatever it happens to be, chain of grocery stores. I think Safeway is tied to Albertsons, which is, I have no idea anymore. Consolidation is an amazing thing in 2020. Anyway, so the grocery stores could order like 200,000 copies of the Avengers. But their deal was they would pay like, let's say if the comic is $1, they might pay, who knows? They would basically commit to making 10 cents off that comic. I'm being crazily inaccurate with numbers, but it doesn't really matter. I'm trying to illustrate a point. They're paying 10 cents. And if they sell that comic, they get 10 cents. If they don't sell that comic, then it gets to be returned and they get their 10 cents back. Now, there's a million, again, little details here, like they don't quite get 10 cents back. They have to handle shipping and blah, 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 blah. Bunch of garbage that nobody cares about. So basically, they get a much smaller amount of revenue. They get like 10 cents. Okay? The direct market, on the other hand, they order the comics. There is no returnability. So if the comic doesn't sell, they're stuck with it. But the comic shop gets, say, 50 cents, way more than 10 cents. So basically, the gamble is this. Hey, if you think you know what your customers will buy, if you think you have a good handle on it, then the direct market is pretty good for you because you'll be making 5x the revenue. And then you don't, granted, if it doesn't sell, you're stuck with it and you got to figure out something else to do with it. But hey, be creative, comic shop. You can turn it into a paper airplane. You could sell it at half price books. You could pee on it, whatever you want to do. It's your comic. You can do whatever you want. Okay, but you're going to make way more revenue because you're committing up front to paying for it. All right. So that's that in a nutshell. That's the dummies version of what returnability is. So why does any of this matter today? Well, two reasons. Number one, a lot of people like to say things like, back in Jim Shooter's day, if a comic sold below 100,000 copies, it would be canceled. That sounds awesome, except that was 100,000 copies in the world of returnability, which means that you had to get 100,000 orders, not 100,000 sales. Now, wait, you might say, with the direct market, if you're selling your comic, if you're a publisher and you're selling your comic to a comic shop, you don't know if all those comics are actually going to be bought. What about the poor comic retailer who doesn't sell his copies? And the answer is that's their fucking problem. Sorry for being blunt. Just this has come up so much that I'm punchy about the whole topic. But basically, if you are a direct market, you're basically taking the risk. It sells or it doesn't sell. Who knows? That's your problem. That's how the direct market worked. Now, the why would anybody sign up for this? Again, because you make more revenue. And if you believe in yourself and you believe in your ability to predict what your customers will buy, the direct market sounds great. It sounds like a great, great model. The problem is back in the 90s, a lot of comic shops and people were like, yeah, we understand our customer base. We can predict what they'll buy. No problem. We'll take that gamble because we believe that, with 5x the revenue, that we could easily predict at least, fairly well to the point where we're making a profit. In 2020, suddenly people are like, yeah, we don't know what our customers will buy. We have no idea. And, the business is screwed. But that is by nature returnability in the direct market. Now, what happens with returnability? Have you ever gone to a flea market or a garage sale or something like that? And there's a box of comics there, and you can't help but notice that these comics have no cover, meaning somebody is selling these things and there is no cover to the comic. There's just, a comic there, and it's missing a cover, and you got the comic. Well, if you care about just reading the comic and you don't care about collectability or anything else, you probably don't care. And if somebody's selling it to you for 10 cents and the cover price was like $2, that's a pretty great deal. You're having a good time. But if you ever go to a garage sale or flea market or whatever it is, in the time of COVID, are there flea markets anymore? I have no idea. But anyway, and you see a stack of comics there with no cover, well, that means that what probably happened is back in the day, some place, a bookstore or a grocery store or a convenience store or a drugstore or a gas station or whatever it happened to be, they returned those comics. How do you return a comic? You rip the cover off, which by the nature of the business agreement they made it unsellable. You then took those comics without a cover, and if you were, doing something illegal, you sold them, or more likely you put them in a box outside your shop and said, free comics, take what you want, and people would take them. And so that's how a bunch of comics without covers got into the wild. That's why when you go to flea markets, you'll sometimes see piles of comics with no cover. It's because somebody went to the drugstore, the convenience store, and they basically helped themselves to a bunch of comics that have been thrown away. And that's what's going on there. So what does all this mean? Well, first off, if we're saying that, back in the days of Jim Shooter, 100,000 copies was threshold for cancellation, that's a stupid argument, and people should stop making it. And it's a stupid argument because the business conditions have changed. It's a little bit like saying, the only way to pay for gas is to go inside the gas station and pay at the counter when we've got, pumps with credit card machines inside of them. The world has fundamentally changed. The 100,000 copy threshold would be amazing. That would be great if that was how strong the comic business is, but it is not. Should it be someday? That would be awesome. Could it be? I'm not even sure if realistically it could be. The problem is that when you take away the newsstand and you're relying only on the direct market, I'm not sure the available market could sustain every comic being over 100,000 copies. There'd have to be some crazy changes, and would have a lot more things would have to happen besides the comic just having better writers or better artists. I mean, you're talking about a fundamental change to the comic business in order for everything to be at that level. That's not where things are today. So what is that actual number of cancellation? Well, the simple answer is, how much does it need to be profitable? Where printing the comic, producing it, and shipping it, and unfortunately, there's not a one-size-fits-all answer. Small publishers have figured out ways to get the comic printed and distributed and everything else. And you've got you got digital sales, and you got trade paperback sales. You have all these other kind of factors in here. But as a general rule of thumb, and this is a number you will not hear on other channels, but this is a number that I pieced together from a ton of other publishers, creators, and retailers. If you are under 8,000 comics a month, if you are under an 8,000 comic run at a $2.99 or higher price point, you are probably losing money unless you are getting substantially more than average in digital sales or trade paperback sales. But if you're under 8,000 copies, you are potentially losing money. Now, what are things that might change that? Well, let's say you're the writer and the artist yourself, and you're willing to take a lower page rate because you got a nice guaranteed salary. Let's say you work for a company, Image, and you are a C-level executive there who has a salary, a yearly salary. Listen, anyway, and you're producing a comic and it sells under that threshold. Well, you're still probably taking home more money. You're not losing money. But for that individual comic, yeah, you're probably not making a big profit. You're certainly not making a big enough profit to sustain yourself and the printing and the colorist and all the other pieces that go along with that. But, if that's your life, more power to you. I mean, good Lord, if you could go to Marvel and get them to pay you like, hypothetically 180, 200,000 a year, hypothetically, I'm just pulling that number completely out of the vapor. If let's say that's what you're bringing home, super. Then you're probably doing fine. I mean, you got your house, you got a little car, you're doing your shit, and you're making your comic. And what do you need in life? Is a comic selling? Who cares? But you're making 180,000 a year, plus some random bennies here and there. Life's fine. What goes wrong with that number? That's the comic business in a nutshell. So why is returnability so important? Because if you're one of those people that goes on Twitter or Facebook or whatever else, and you want to talk about how, back in, Jim Shooter came into Marvel, he'd cancel all the comics that weren't selling under 100,000. Guess what? He'd cancel 98% of all the comics. And the crazy part is he couldn't replace those with better comics. Let's say we brought back, Jim Lee, Eric Larson, Todd McFarlane, Mark Silvestri, Jim Valentino, well, not Jim Valentino, but the others that sold a lot of comics. Let's say all the Rob Liefeld, sure, throw him in there. Let's say they all came back to Marvel and they all started doing comics and they all started selling stuff. Guess what? They would have a struggle beating 100,000 copies sold unless you radically changed the marketplace in which comics were offered. Meaning, if you recreated the Newsstand, where you had returnability, but it basically put comics in a lot more places. That's one thing. Let's say everybody took a bunch of crack, and then suddenly everybody's going to a comic store every week. I mean, that would be nice. That'd be great. But in today's marketplace, the idea that into the direct market world you would sell on average 100,000 copies of a comic, you're high. That's not going to happen. Not in today's world. You would have to expand the market, let alone the content of the comic. You could put the most amazing creators possible in a comic. Those creators, like if suddenly Todd McFarlane came to Marvel, Todd McFarlane can do maybe one comic a month, maybe. He can't do 30. So the idea that, you just can't wave a magic wand and suddenly all the comics are making more than 100,000 in sales. It just, that would not happen. So that's the factor around returnability, the market, where it is today. I'm sorry if this sounds like a bunch of, bad news or whatever the hell it sounds like. I'm just trying to make it as clear as possible. This is what the current market looks like. Love it, hate it, change it, whatever you want to say. This is what we're currently dealing with as a comic business. So if we want to make some changes, we want to grow comics, we want to do all these things, we're going to have to start with some pretty fundamental things, which is, number one, figure out how the direct market can actually be viable. That's going to have to be number one. Does this help? Does that explain things? What do you think? Leave a comment below, ask some questions. I'll try and answer them. Like, subscribe, click the bell for notifications, follow me on social media, send me an email, blah, 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 blah. Legitimately, thank you for listening.